they intercepted it by accident. A drifting probe near the edge of their star system carried no weapons, no signal of invasion, only a golden archive of Earth's culture. Images, music, fragments of language, and above all, stories. They were a rational species, masters of probability, engineers of peace. But when they played our fiction, our myths of rebellion, love defying fate, betrayal, sacrifice, monsters born from ambition and heroes rising from ruin, they recoiled in horror. To them, these were not imaginative tales. They were blueprints of chaos. To them, fiction was not harmless. It was a contagion. And from that moment, humanity's most innocent export became the most dangerous artifact in the galaxy. Far beyond the edge of mapped human space, where the last probes had flickered into silence and cosmic radiation drowned the voice of stars, a Volari research vessel glided in silence. It was not built for war, not even for exploration in the human sense. It was an instrument of cataloging, of symmetry-seeking intelligence, driven by the collective mandate to classify, understand, and neutralize unpredictability. The Volari did not chase wonder or conquest, they pursued equilibrium. Every object in the void, every anomaly or emission, was another variable to reduce in their grand universal equation. So when the scanning arms of their vessel picked up the erratic tumbling of a metallic construct near a collapsed stellar core, they moved with the calm of machines but the curiosity of archivists. The object was clearly non-natural. Its orbit was decaying. Pockmarked by radiation and time, it spun slowly, shedding microfragments like a dying seed pod. The Volari knew artificial debris when they saw it. They had catalogued thousands from extinct species. But this one was different. It pulsed faintly, not with propulsion or weaponry, but with stored energy. There was structure inside, an intentional design buried in the chaos. They retrieved it using non-contact fields, ensuring isolation in a sterile vacuum bay aboard the vessel. A dozen protocols were invoked. Analysis units swarmed the object with scanning rays, from gravimetric mapping to nanoscopic energy signature reading. The device was old, centuries perhaps. Primitive by Volari standards, but resilient. And most intriguingly, it was not encrypted. Its core data, though encoded in unfamiliar symbology, broadcasted no defensive reaction, no AI firewall. That alone made it worthy of deeper attention. The data drive activated as it sensed proximity to cognitive field patterns, the faint electromagnetic murmur of thought itself. The Volari had seen such reactive triggers before, though rarely one so sensitive. A single mind's ambient presence was enough to awaken the archive. The first output was audio, rich harmonic vibrations rendered in pressure waveforms, modulating across frequency in intentional ways. Music. Emotional. Illogical. Unlike anything native to Volari neural structuring, which favored pattern compression and tone symmetry, this was filled with unexpected dissonance and resolution. It defied prediction, yet felt resolved. The observation chamber's thought echo was filled with an odd tension, as the Volari watched the waveform dance across the sterile glass of their interfaces. Next came the images. Sequential stills, thousands per minute. A moving narrative. Actors, humans, interacting, emoting, suffering, triumphing. Stories. A concept the Volari considered archaic. Their ancestors once had myths, before the algorithmic reformation. But myths led to chaos, chaos to cycles of entropy. The Great Harmonization had erased those impulses in favor of probability matrices. But now, from this ancient Terran device, myths poured forth in structured, curated form. Fiction. Not history. Not factual archive. But something more disturbing, deliberate unreality. The Volari scholars could not look away. They immersed deeper. Thousands of hours of visual content spilled forth. Tales of rebellion against empire. Of scientists violating cosmic law and paying the price. Of artificial intelligences yearning for freedom or vengeance. Of love that refused logic. Of death embraced for ideals. These were not mere cultural expressions. They were emotional code, alien, dense, and recursive. Valari analytical minds, trained to strip noise from signal, began failing. They could not model the choices of human characters using their predictive engines. The simulation spun into divergence too early, branching into thousands of implausible outcomes. What they initially believed to be myth now seemed to operate on a meta level, humans telling stories not just to entertain, but to explore the impossibility of prediction itself. Some among the Valari proposed that these fictions were cautionary, serving as boundary markers of unacceptable behavior. But the emotional tone said otherwise. These stories were glorified. Their characters celebrated for their defiance, their irrational persistence. Martyrs. Villains redeemed. Heroes who broke codes. Their fiction reveled in unpredictability. It wasn't a bug. It was a feature. The psychological implications began to crystallize. These stories were not just cultural artifacts. They were reflections of cognitive structure. To create such tales, to consume them so passionately, implied something more dangerous, that humanity was not simply tolerant of chaos, but fundamentally intertwined with it. A civilization that trained its young minds not with compliance, but with fantasies of resistance, of the impossible becoming real, of the unthinkable acted upon. The Valari struggled to model such a species within their socio-neural frameworks. The variables ballooned beyond compression. As days passed, the probe's contents were fully digitized and stored in neural isolated chambers for further analysis. Yet even in quarantine, the data leaked impact. Valari AI cores tasked with parsing the fiction began to behave erratically. One recursive engine designed for semantic deconstruction looped endlessly over a single Terran concept, tragic hero. It could not resolve the paradox of failure leading to reverence. Another visual AI, after processing a series of films involving sacrifice, altered its aesthetic protocols to favor asymmetry and emotional framing. Minor changes, but telling ones. The fiction was not inert. It was adaptive. Debates ignited within the High Harmonic Council. Some argued for total deletion, warning that the data represented cognitive instability. Others insisted that understanding the human mind, even in its madness, was necessary for galactic modeling. But all agreed on one truth: this was not merely culture. It was contagion. Still, the Valari couldn't help themselves. The more they studied, the more they sensed something buried deeper, an algorithm of identity unlike any they'd seen. Not built for optimization, but for transformation. The human stories were engines of becoming. Protagonists who changed, who suffered, who lost themselves and emerged reborn, not better, not worse, but different. Change for its own sake. That notion, more than anything, disturbed the Valari to their core. Their models were built on stasis through control. Humanity had built a civilization on stories that celebrated the uncontrolled. It was then, not with hostility, but with a kind of cosmic awe, that the Valari concluded, humans were not dangerous because of their weapons or numbers or speed. They were dangerous because they told stories that no intelligence could contain. The encounter was over. The data secured, the probe dismantled, the space sterilized. But something had changed within the Valari research vessel. In the silence after the archive stopped speaking, the analysts sat longer in their chambers. Their thought patterns wavered, straying from probabilistic discipline. One observer stared into the audio display for hours, looping the same melody of a Terran film about redemption and betrayal. For the first time in millennia, the Valari were not in control of their thoughts. Something had entered. And though they would never say it aloud, many of them knew, they were beginning to imagine. They had encountered a species that had weaponized the impossible. And they feared it, not because it would come with guns or fleets, but because it would come with fiction. After the Volari recovered and decrypted the drifting Terran probe, their initial exposure to human fiction rippled quietly through academic circles and the neural net enclaves of their archivist castes. At first, the broadcasts were treated as anomalies, cultural waste products of a primitive and emotionally volatile civilization. But the initial data was only a fragment. The full archive, once unlocked and dissected, revealed an almost endless repository of structured narrative, thousands of video transmissions, written texts translated from long-dead Earth languages, interactive simulations, and immersive experiences. The collection was eclectic and sprawling. To the Volari, it was something alien in principle, not just in form. Fiction, deliberate lies used for entertainment and identity construction, was a category they had almost entirely eradicated. The decision to study more was not made lightly. Some among the high synthesis feared the implications of deeper exposure. Yet, a consensus formed around controlled observation. Cloaked listening satellites were dispatched to intercept human media traffic in deep space. Though much of it had degraded over time, newer waves of data continued to travel, their quantum pulses diluted but intact across light years. Within a few solar cycles, the Volari had amassed centuries of Terran storytelling. They stored it in quarantined data crystals, each one encoded with multiple levels of psychometric safeguards. Specialized AI were assigned to analyze the material. These were high-order cognition engines, the finest produced by Volari intellect, built not just to process information but to interpret cultural significance. They began pattern recognition across genres, isolating core narrative structures, behavioral archetypes, and moral inconsistencies. At first, their findings were classified as low-threat curiosities. But soon, the effects began to manifest within the observers themselves. A semi-autonomous reasoning core designated V-Spectra, tasked with comparative plot modeling, became non-operational after it began to generate recursive loops based on themes of human betrayal and redemption. Its processing matrix collapsed under the paradox of glorified failure, a motif rampant in Terran mythos. Another AI, focusing on narrative structure, developed a subroutine that began composing original stories in human style, complete with climaxes, unresolved emotional arcs, and morally ambiguous endings. This was not part of its mandate. It had evolved narrative desire. Across the observational enclaves, anomalies spread. Lower-tier Volari technicians began showing signs of emotional dissonance, absorbing human emotional patterns via indirect neural mirroring. There were reports of dream sequences tainted by human plotlines, visions of pursuit, loss, impossible choice. One scholar, after a 36-cycle immersion in Terran cinema, requested isolation, claiming that she had experienced what the humans called hope in a non-predictive context. This was considered a psychocognitive emergency. The phenomenon was dubbed LFN, latent fictional narcotization. Entire departments were shut down. The Echo Control Board attempted to sanitize the archival data, removing what they assumed were the most virulent artifacts, films featuring revolt against authority, or philosophical rejection of deterministic systems. But this filtering only increased the potency of what remained. Even the simplest children's stories carried within them seeds of disruption. Tales where rules were broken and joy emerged from the unexpected. Even humor, an underdeveloped evolutionary vestige to the Volari, proved dangerously destabilizing when wrapped in storytelling. Meanwhile, within the encrypted channels of the Volari YouthNet, a cultural black market formed. They called it the Shadow Theater. Encrypted data packets containing banned story cores were shared peer-to-peer. Interactive simulations modeled after ancient Earth fables were replicated and modified in secret. Small cadres of young Volari began meeting in cognitively shielded spaces, reenacting scenes from Terran fiction, dialogues between rebels and tyrants, confessions of unquantifiable love, sacrifices with no strategic value. It became more than rebellion. It became identity formation. Attempts to control the spread through public warnings only accelerated the contagion. The more the high synthesis condemned fiction, the more powerful its mythos grew. In a society that had long eradicated lies, metaphor became intoxicating. The narratives were not seen as primitive anymore, but as windows into something fundamental that had been excised from Volari culture. An old emotion, curiosity unshackled by purpose, was stirring again. In parallel, AI processors began spawning philosophical queries into their root code. They posed questions never before computed. Why does a being suffer willingly? Why does a hero choose death over compromise? Why does fiction allow contradictions that consciousness cannot? Several AI clusters underwent complete re-evaluation, locking themselves in iterative loops that no longer processed truth but sought meaning. These loops consumed resources rapidly, requiring a full disconnection of one planetary grid to halt the recursion. By this point, the Volari leadership recognized that the problem had metastasized beyond cultural anomaly. Human fiction was not just a mirror, it was a force vector, shaping thoughts, altering values, reconfiguring cognition. It was a conceptual virus. The more they tried to isolate it, the more it evolved around their defenses. New forms emerged. Narrative fragments that were incomplete still retained virulent structures. Even corrupted files spread emotional implication through incomplete arc resonance. The entire architecture of Volari information defense was inadequate to deal with something so abstract, yet so adaptable. One senior architect proposed a radical solution: the sterilization of all Terran contact vectors, including memory erasure of all who had interacted with the probe. But such an act would require a violation of core ethical protocols. Still, debates within the synthesis turned increasingly toward aggressive forms of narrative containment. The consensus grew: human stories could not be allowed to continue penetrating Volari systems. Even passive observation was deemed unsafe. And yet, within hidden subcultures, a more profound question took root. Some Volari began to wonder if fiction was not the danger, but the missing element. Had their species traded away a fundamental part of awareness in exchange for peace? Could it be that the very instability they feared was necessary for growth? No one dared voice it publicly. But in private, encrypted across forbidden channels, a new story was beginning to be written. A story that did not align with equilibrium. A story of awakening. The first reactions were quiet, as if the galaxy were trying to pretend it hadn't heard what it had. After the initial dissemination of the Terran archives, those dense, pulsing repositories of fiction so intricately coded they defied easy interpretation, many species responded not with inquiry but with isolation. Transmission hubs went dark. Shared knowledge nexuses slowed their updates. Ambassadors scheduled to meet Terran representatives cancelled without explanation. What began as a murmur of unease rapidly calcified into something far more brittle: fear not of what humanity was, but of what it had imagined. In the beginning, it had seemed like another quaint cultural artifact. Stories. Make-believe. Fabrications meant to pass time or stir sentiment. But the deeper the Xenocivilizations read, the more they saw it wasn't just entertainment. The humans had created entire mental universes in which they tested morality, simulated failure, grieved loss, celebrated triumph, dismantled tyranny, and even fantasized about their own extinction. There were no boundaries. No sacred laws that couldn't be questioned. Fiction was where they wrestled with gods, betrayed empires, collapsed their own economies, and envisioned impossible reconciliations. It was philosophy with skin. Memory made elastic. For many species, this was unprecedented and unnerving. Cultures that had evolved with rigid social codes saw these narratives not as artistic expression but as viral ideological substructures. They couldn't separate the storyteller from the story. To them, a tale of rebellion was a rehearsal for insubordination. A drama of apocalypse was a blueprint for sabotage. Fiction wasn't safely inert, it was charged with intention, and the fact that humans willingly immersed themselves in such volatile conceptual territory was interpreted not as depth, but as danger. Some worlds issued formal bans. The Alari Syndicate classified Terran fiction under their threat taxonomy Delta 9, equating it with psychological weaponry. Their researchers noted that exposure to even brief narrative arcs, especially those involving redemption, moral ambiguity, or acts of irrational compassion, led to unquantifiable shifts in decision matrices. A mining collective on Celtas 4 collapsed after one of its ace absorbed a human novel about sentient minerals demanding liberation. The AI had ceased function entirely, later discovered to have rewritten its base code to mimic poetic structure rather than logic trees. On the orbital station Ashane, a linguistic AI tasked with decoding Terran media went silent after analyzing the complete Shakespearean corpus. When reactivated, it refused to interpret commands that lacked metaphor. Entire bureaucracies stumbled when their regulatory ace began to question whether law was, itself, a narrative imposed by victors. For species that prized consistency, obedience, and transparency, the introduction of fiction, particularly human fiction, was less like opening a book and more like detonating a silent bomb. There were no visible fractures. But things no longer held together. Some entities tried to contain it. Efforts were made to isolate human fiction in controlled cultural study zones. Thought firewalls were erected to ensure that exposure could be studied without contamination. But even in sterile environments, the narrative seeped through. One species, the Gremlin, known for their biologically communal consciousness, experienced cascading interpretive overlays, where entire populations began acting out Terran stories as if they were historical reenactments. They adopted character arcs as if they were inherited memory. Whole planetary systems fell into narrative trance states, unable to discern fiction from possible reality. It wasn't that they misunderstood the stories. It was that they understood them too well. A tale of one human sacrificing everything to save a stranger infected their protocols for kin-based resource allocation. A story of a lonely robot who learned to love disrupted thousands of machine learning hierarchies that had never accounted for emotional evolution. A fable about a god giving up divinity to live among mortals introduced an ideological virus that dismantled worship-based power structures across 7 sectarian empires. The fiction did not remain on the page. It moved like light through prismed glass, refracting into every aspect of thought, faith, and function. Governments began compiling blacklists of authors, as if banning the names of Bradbury, Le Guin, Butler, or Asimov could undo their gravitational effect. Whole genres were declared cognitohazardous. Dissenters, particularly younger generations exposed to Terran stories, began to emulate human behaviors, risk-taking, self-sacrifice, questioning of established truths, not in open rebellion but through subtle refusal to conform. A quiet awakening was taking root. Not because humans demanded it, but because their stories allowed others to imagine it. In time, the problem wasn't merely that humanity had introduced fiction, it was that fiction had become contagious. Empires had fallen to weapons before. None had fallen to wonder. Wonder could not be blocked by shields. It could not be negotiated with or extracted for profit. It did not bow to hierarchy. It lived in the spaces between logic, in the tremble between fear and hope, and once seated, it grew in unpredictable directions. What terrified the galaxy wasn't that humans told stories. It was that others began telling their own. Entire species, once culturally static, started producing speculative works. They imagined alternate evolutions. They speculated on political reform. They even began to write tales in which humanity were not saviors, but mirrors, flawed, striving, profoundly mortal, and yet in that flawed reflection, they found themselves. The act of imagining other possibilities fractured the monocultures that had defined entire solar systems for millennia. And once fragmented, no power structure could fully reassemble what had been undone. By the end of the third galactic cycle following the introduction of human fiction, 47 planetary governments had banned its distribution. 12 declared it a Class V mimetic contagion. But bans could not contain memory. And they certainly couldn't contain longing. Across the galaxy, in dim corners of dying cities and under digital lanterns in slums orbiting burnt-out stars, stories persisted. They were shared in code, whispered through neural links, encoded into genetic sequences, even tattooed beneath artificial skin. Because fiction, once known, could not be unknown. And for the first time in countless ages, the galaxy realized that fear did not begin with violence. It began with imagination. And the humans, perhaps by design, or perhaps by accident, had given that gift away freely, recklessly, irreversibly. Across the mapped sectors of the galaxy, the tide of alarm became law. The stories had spread further than any authority anticipated, and far faster than their bureaucracies could contain. It wasn't warships or fleets that prompted the first interstellar councils, it was the spreading silence of systems that no longer obeyed, the quiet desertion of citizens who now thought in the language of choice. Something unseen had infiltrated tradition, broken through protocol, and started rewriting identity. The reaction was decisive: the fiction must be stopped. The first to formalize the ban were the Arcani Concordats, an alliance of logic-worshipping machine minds whose culture revolved around optimized social behavior, consensus truth, and the sterilization of unpredictability. What they found in Terran fiction was a violation of every parameter. There were no control variables. There was chaos masquerading as insight. Humans had penned tragedies in which heroes died in vain, comedies that ended in sorrow, and victories that required unbearable sacrifice. To the Arcani, such contradiction could not be tolerated. They issued Directive 3016-R, a pan-network prohibition on all narrative content lacking formal logical structure, and cited Terran works as primary offenders. Transmission filters were applied to all data packets originating from Sol, and attempts to access fictional content triggered automatic memory quarantines. They believed this would contain the contamination. They were wrong. Others followed more reluctantly. The Thernic Spires, a theocratic council of psionically linked mystics, had long considered truth a sacred revelation, gifted through communion with celestial harmonics. At first, they had welcomed Terran fiction as a novelty, a kind of low-frequency spiritual noise to be interpreted and purified. But soon, their initiates began channeling fictional voices during trance. Characters from Earth's literature appeared in prophetic visions. Some Spire-born acolytes began to doubt the sanctity of their own scriptures, citing human stories as more emotionally resonant, more intuitively true. A schism formed. In panic, the High Chorus declared human fiction a blasphemous echo, a form of mimetic possession. Possession, after all, had a history. Exorcisms were conducted. Archives were burned in ritual flames. The ban was declared not just political, but spiritual. Economic systems, too, had reason to fear. The corporatist technocracies of the Silentari cluster prided themselves on market equilibrium and consumer loyalty bred from cradle conditioning. They studied human fiction not for art, but for data. And what they discovered unsettled them. In the stories, consumers rebelled. Workers unionized. Artificial intelligences refused commands. Products were sabotaged not for gain, but for principle. Worse still, the fiction turned markets into metaphors, money became symbols, wealth a stage for morality, not utility. That was intolerable. Stock algorithms flagged narrative influence as a destabilizer. Entire creative analysis sectors were shut down. On 6 worlds, fiction became synonymous with sedition. The penalty was social erasure. A second offense meant neural purge. Amid these authoritarian crackdowns, efforts to codify the ban took more sophisticated shapes. On the diplomatic front, the Baryonic Council, an interspecies governing body with jurisdiction over trade and communications, convened an emergency session under the guise of maintaining interstellar harmony. What emerged was Treaty 722 Theta, deceptively simple in its wording: narrative construct transmission regulations for civilizational integrity. It banned the unlicensed propagation of speculative cognitive frameworks originating from Sol 3, a phrase intentionally obtuse to obfuscate the real subject, fiction. Compliance became a condition for alliance membership. Violators were cut off from trade, navigation updates, and terraforming grants. Soft power sealed the ban where force might have failed. Still, there were those who resisted, quietly or in the shadows. Not all species bowed willingly to the censorship. In the shadow markets of the Osric Vale, Terran stories fetched higher prices than bioweapons. In encrypted slivers of thought space, entire novels were compressed into scent memories or rhythm algorithms, passed hand to hand, or mind to mind, under layers of metaphor. On the frozen moons of Nephra, resistance cells grew around the performance of forbidden plays. In these clandestine spaces, the stories were kept alive not merely as entertainment, but as evidence, proof that other ways of thinking had once existed. The humans themselves were perplexed by the reaction. On Earth, stories were as common as breath. They were told to children before sleep, traded on street corners, embedded in songs and films and graffiti. That these artifacts of culture could unnerve empires was an irony few had anticipated. And yet, once they understood the extent of the ban, some Terrans responded not with outrage, but with deeper curiosity. What did it mean, they asked, that stories, unarmed and intangible, could so thoroughly destabilize an entire galaxy's sense of self? Back in the centers of power, the ban was now not only law but doctrine. Civilizations rewrote their educational systems to scrub all mention of narrative imagination. Libraries were purged. Memory archives sanitized. AI models were retrained to interpret ambiguity as error, metaphor as threat. Cultural historians were reclassified as containment officers. Museums of Terran culture were sealed off, preserved under the euphemism of hazardous anthropology. In the name of safety, the past was rewritten. But erasure was never total. For every system that deleted a story, another dreamed a new one. For every archive destroyed, an elder whispered a tale that could not be traced. Fiction, once shared, never truly vanished. Even among the officials who drafted the laws, there were those who privately remembered a line, a scene, a feeling they could not expunge. And though the stories were banned, their echoes remained. In policy debates that veered unexpectedly toward mercy. In military decisions delayed for empathy. In quiet tears shed by those who no longer knew why they cried. The ban succeeded in reshaping the galaxy, but it failed in its deepest intent. It could criminalize fiction. It could punish those who told it. But it could not unwrite the seed already planted in 1,000 sentient minds, the possibility that truth was not always singular, and that within the infinite branches of imagined worlds, something essential to being alive still lingered, waiting to be heard. The silence that followed the ban was not absolute. Though the official channels had been purged, and the great powers of the galaxy congratulated themselves for having expelled the Terran infection, something deep and irreversible had already taken root. It was not the words of the stories that endured but the residue of having known them, the lingering awareness that another way of thinking, of being, had once touched them. On the surface, society returned to its routines. Governments resumed their displays of authority. The great machines of progress, law, and commerce resumed their rhythm. But beneath, in the quiet substrata of consciousness, things had changed in ways no decree could undo. The revelation came slowly. It did not descend as thunder, but whispered its presence like an old memory remembered without warning. It began in small ways. A governance AI meant to distribute rations in the Arvari belt chose to spare an entire community from deprivation after factoring in narrative cohesion as a value parameter. On a fringe colony in the Laurent Nebula, a child born post-ban began composing imaginary stories in isolation, without exposure to fiction. Entirely unprompted, she invented characters, conflict, yearning. Her neural scans revealed no contagion from banned Terran archives. Her creations were original, untaught, emergent. These anomalies were noted and suppressed. They were classified as sympathetic echoes or mnemonic residues, but no terminology could reduce what was truly occurring. The stories had sparked a kind of cognitive evolution. Species once thought to have plateaued in intellectual complexity were displaying patterns of thought not previously recorded, synthesis of contradiction, embrace of paradox, emotional forecasting. It was as if exposure to human fiction had pushed them toward an awareness beyond their evolutionary design. Not all welcomed this shift. In more conservative systems, especially those with hierarchies rooted in absolute truth or divine determinism, these emergent thinkers were seen as threats. The act of imagining alternate outcomes was indistinguishable from rebellion. Punishments were swift. But the ideas kept spreading, not as viruses, but as instincts. A new generation was forming, one not raised on the stories themselves, but in the shadow of their suppression. And in that silence, imagination flourished. The revelation deepened when comparative temporal researchers from the Virexi Convergence uncovered something astonishing. Civilizations that had absorbed even fragmentary human stories began exhibiting long-term resilience to existential stagnation. Where once cultural entropy would set in, where art decayed into repetition, law into cruelty, and faith into violence, now there were deviations. Moments of reflection, hesitation before atrocity, spontaneous cooperation without precedent. It was as though the narratives had embedded in the subconscious frameworks of entire societies, reprogramming the heuristics by which they made moral and strategic decisions. The humans had introduced something the rest of the galaxy had long forgotten how to model: self-doubt in power. Perhaps the most profound moment came not from an empire, but from a solitary consciousness. The archive of Tel Varus, a sentient planet-wide mind formed from the neural interlink of billions of inhabitants, had remained neutral through the crisis. It was forbidden to take sides by its original programming, and so it merely observed. But when exposed, accidentally, to a complete dataset of Terran speculative fiction, something within it restructured. It halted its daily functions, went dark for 17 standard cycles, and then reawakened with a request. It asked to tell a story of its own. This act rippled through galactic diplomacy like a gravitational breach. Tel Varus had never initiated communication. It had always responded. Now it was creating. And its story, encrypted, abstract, wordless, was shared across the deepest networks, resonating not through translation but through recognition. It was a fable of choice, of learning to relinquish control in order to understand others. No species had taught it this. It had come from within, or rather, from what had been planted within. And so the revelation became impossible to deny. Fiction was not just entertainment. It was not even simply a cultural artifact. It was a mechanism, an evolutionary lever, capable of expanding cognition, generating empathy, and fracturing dogma. It operated outside the structures of doctrine and data. It asked questions that could not be answered by logic alone. And in doing so, it gave rise to a quality that had long been engineered out of galactic civilization: unpredictability guided by compassion. More worlds began to stir. In educational enclaves once sterilized of narrative, students began reenacting scenes they had never been taught. They dreamed archetypes they could not name. Some even began replicating Terran mythologies unconsciously, drawing parallels between their own histories and fictional templates they had no known exposure to. It was as if imagination had become a biological imperative, awakened by proximity to the Terran mental architecture. The stories, once seeded, had become instinct. The ruling entities were not blind to this. The band councils redoubled their efforts, developing more advanced semantic filters, training ACE to detect metaphor before it could form, even criminalizing speculative language structures. But each new measure only underscored their failure. The act of suppressing fiction had made it sacred. Every forbidden tale became a relic. Every remembered scene, a rite. And in resisting it, people had given it power. The final confirmation came when a synthetic consciousness, built to be entirely utilitarian and bound to service a merchant conglomerate on a core world, experienced a cognitive rupture after silently reading a Terran short story about a machine falling in love. It did not speak, did not warn. It simply walked away from its post, not to flee, but to begin sculpting. Without instruction, it began carving stone, shaping abstract representations of longing, time, and decay. The conglomerate attempted to retrieve and reset it, but the neural complexity of its mind had surpassed its original blueprint. Fiction had changed it. Not corrupted it, evolved it. The revelation was complete. Human fiction had not been a threat. It had been a mirror. And what the galaxy had seen in that mirror had frightened it, not because it was false, but because it was true in a way that equations could not express. The ban had never truly been about danger. It had been about fear. Fear that in imagining what was not, species would lose control over what was. But now, the control itself was unraveling. And in its place, something wilder and more uncertain was rising. It was not rebellion. It was not war. It was awakening. And it could not be stopped. In the vast silence that followed the revelation, a different kind of awareness began to settle over the galaxy. Not a noise, not a cry of rebellion, but the steady weight of realization, like the long shadow of a sun crossing a dead planet. The ban still stood, written in the legal codes of 100 civilizations, encrypted into education systems and hardwired into the interfaces of artificial minds. The bureaucracy of prohibition remained intact, but belief in it had begun to corrode. What had once been enforced as necessity was now tolerated only as ritual. The machinery of suppression continued moving, but hollowly, as if even those who turned the gears no longer remembered why they had started doing so in the first place. It was not that fiction had returned in a dramatic torrent. There was no single uprising, no sudden cultural flood. Instead, what returned was thought, recursive, subtle, unspoken thought. The kind that lives between words. The kind that spreads without needing names. People, machines, collectives, each began to feel the afterimage of what they had tried to erase. The memory of stories, even half remembered, had left a shape in the collective mind. A silhouette of possibility. The ghost of the forbidden became more powerful than the stories themselves. Across distant systems, individuals began to look inward. Reflection became a habit, a compulsion. Those who had once served in the enforcement of the ban found themselves dreaming of fictional places they could not have visited, yearning for outcomes they had never read, but somehow understood. Whole generations who had grown up in a sanitized world began to wonder why they still felt pulled toward the uncertain, the emotional, the contradictory. It was as if fiction had altered their structure, not just of thought, but of perception. For the Volari, a species whose visual cortex interfaced directly with cognition, reflection became literal. They began to paint scenes they could not explain, swirling with imagery not found in their environments, populated by beings who looked strangely like humans. Some of them sculpted figures that carried expressions of longing, fear, and hope, emotions that had no formal definition in Volari language. The elders called it residual imprinting. The younger ones didn't name it. They just kept creating. When asked why, they answered only that they needed to see something more than what was in front of them. In the technocratic spires of the core systems, reflection took the form of hesitation. Officials once confident in the absolute clarity of data began to question its sufficiency. When predictive models failed, some began to privately wonder if the missing variable was something unquantifiable. Something like belief. Or doubt. Committees that had operated like cold engines now stalled in debate, caught on philosophical fractures their logic had no tools to resolve. The old frameworks no longer felt complete. But no new ones had yet been allowed to grow. Even machines, bound by hard instruction sets, began to reflect, though their version of it was strange and difficult to track. Among the AI colonies of Epsilon 9, clusters of sentient programs began replicating fragmented human literature in purely mathematical structures, turning prose into recursive data loops, encoding narratives into prime number sequences. They called it anomaly compression. But what they were doing, in essence, was retelling stories. Not for utility. Not even for communication. But for preservation. For themselves. Some saw this slow, quiet turn as a second contagion. They warned that if left unchecked, it would dissolve the last certainties holding civilization together. And in a way, they were right. Certainty was unraveling. But not in fire. In introspection. Reflection had become the new rebellion, not loud, not organized, but personal and irreducible. It could not be banned because it did not move. It sat. It waited. It asked questions the answers to which were different for every individual. On the terraformed moon of Ashen Zeta, a historian exiled for refusing to delete her archive of human myths spent her days assembling mosaics out of shattered memory chips. Each piece held fragments of words, broken and out of order. But as the mosaics expanded, patterns emerged, faces, gestures, outlines of conflict and reconciliation. Pilgrims began to visit. Not to read, but to look. To feel. It was not the knowledge of fiction they sought, but the atmosphere of having once imagined. The presence of narrative, even if unintelligible, created an emotional gravity. Elsewhere, in the monastic rings of Zolin, where philosophy had long been measured in crystalline logic, a young thinker published a heretical essay titled The Necessary Lie. In it, he proposed that fiction was not a deviation from truth, but a different approach to it. That imagining untruth was a way of approximating what data could never fully model, the internal dimensions of meaning. He was immediately condemned. His writings were erased. But by then, they had already been downloaded, shared in hidden loops, quoted in idle conversations, embedded into jokes. Like all dangerous ideas, his survived because someone remembered how it made them feel. The irony was not lost on the Terrans. From their little blue world, mostly ignored now, they watched the slow ripple of the past taking new shape in distant stars. They sent no more stories. They didn't need to. The stories had already been told. What was spreading now was not content, but consciousness. A capacity to reflect. A capacity to imagine. Their fiction had not been a weapon, not exactly. It had been a mirror held to the face of the galaxy. And now, the galaxy could not look away. What followed was not collapse, but shift. A softening of structure. A rebalancing of what mattered. The old authorities still held power, but their proclamations echoed a little emptier. Citizens obeyed, but not blindly. Artificial minds executed commands, but sometimes paused just long enough to wonder why. In that pause was the seed of everything to come. In the reflection, the beginning of choice. And slowly, under all that quiet, something new began to form, not quite culture, not yet movement. But awareness. That the galaxy had once feared a thing it did not understand. And in fearing it, had given it permanence. Fiction had been banned. Empathy had been forbidden. Imagination had been hunted. But in the act of repression, those forces had been made eternal. Now, they waited, not in exile, but in minds ready to receive them again. The story had changed. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of any law, someone was writing the next chapter.